The popular narrative entering this weekend was that Red Bull had finally cracked the 2026 regulations after securing 3 podiums in the last 4 Grands Prix. But Max Verstappen's home sprint qualifying at Zandvoort just shattered that illusion with a P6 finish and a 1012.094 lap time that left him exactly 5:27 seconds adrift of George Russell's pole position. This wasn't a minor fluctuation or a traffic-affected outlier on a tight circuit, because the race's official team-by-team analysis has now classified the RB22 as merely the 4th best car in the field for this specific session, placing the defending champion firmly in the losers column despite the momentum everyone assumed he carried into his home race. That half-second deficit exposes a fundamental mechanical confusion within the car itself, raising a critical question about whether this is simply a one-off setup disaster unique to Zandvoort's banking and wind conditions, or if the competitive order has actually shifted beneath Red Bull's feet right when they thought they had stabilized their season. Verstappen himself confirmed the issue wasn't driver error or track evolution when he told Formula 1.com that it was just a bit tricky to find the grip and the balance, admitting the car remained unpredictable even after significant overnight work. He had already run to the gravel during FP1 while battling simultaneous understeer and oversteer, a combination that suggests the aerodynamic platform is failing to maintain a consistent load through the corner phases rather than suffering from a simple tire temperature problem. By the time sprint qualifying arrived, he noted the car was already a step forward from that disastrous morning session, yet he was still lacking a little bit to be further up the road, which tells us the engineering fixes are moving in the right direction but aren't arriving fast enough to match the development rate of Mercedes or McLaren. So where does that leave the championship picture if the car's peak performance window is this narrow? Grip vanished, balance failed, pace stalled. This specific inability to dial out the handling vices is what makes the result so concerning for the rest of the 2026 campaign, because Verstappen explicitly stated in his post-session remarks to Formula 1.com that the situation was hit and miss, and he could not tell anyone right now what they might find for tomorrow. That uncertainty is the real story here, not just the grid position itself, because it implies the team lacks a clear theoretical model for why the car behaves this way under these specific regulatory constraints. When a driver of his caliber cannot predict whether the next adjustment will help or hurt, it usually indicates the car is operating outside its intended design envelope, forcing the engineers to rely on trial and error rather than simulation data. We know the RB22 has shown flashes of genuine pace recently, but seeing it regress to 4th best status at a track where Verstappen historically dominates forces us to ask if those recent podiums were actually masking a deeper instability that only reveals itself when the margins get this tight. That 5:27 second gap to George Russell represents a massive chasm in modern Formula 1 terms, especially when you consider this happened at Zandvoort, a venue where Verstappen has historically extracted performance that others simply cannot match. The timing makes the deficit even more jarring, because Red Bull entered this weekend riding a wave of confidence after converting 3 podium finishes across the previous 4 Grands Prix, leading many paddock observers to believe the team had finally unlocked the secret to the new 2026 power unit and chassis integration. Seeing that progress evaporate in a single qualifying session suggests the RB22's performance envelope is far more fragile than the recent results indicated. And it forces us to reconsider whether those earlier successes were sustainable achievements or merely favorable alignments of circumstance and competitor misfortune. Data confirms magnitude, half-second, massive deficit. Verstappen's P6 classification means he will start the sprint race from the 3rd row, a position that severely limits his ability to capitalize on any early chaos or strategic opportunities that typically define these shorter format events. What makes this particularly stinging is that the gap wasn't caused by a yellow flag or a botched tire preparation, but rather by pure pace deficiency relative to the frontrunners during a clean SQ3 run. When we look at the sector times and the overall classification, it becomes clear that the car was consistently losing time through the technical sections where mechanical grip and aerodynamic stability matter most, not just on the straights where power unit differences usually show up. This distinction is crucial because it shifts the blame away from the engine department and squarely onto the chassis and setup philosophy, areas where Red Bull has traditionally been the benchmark but now appears to be chasing answers. So, what does this specific qualifying result tell us about the car's behavior under pressure? It tells us that the recent podium streak may have been masking underlying inconsistencies that only emerge when the track conditions or competitive intensity reaches a certain threshold. Verstappen noted to Formula 1.com that they managed to out-qualify one car, but the tone of that comment reveals how much the team's expectations have shifted from dominating the field to fighting for scraps in the midfield battle. That psychological adjustment is perhaps the most significant exposure of all, because it shows the driver himself recognizes that the current package cannot be relied upon to deliver front-row pace on demand. We are watching a champion adapt to a machine that no longer responds to his inputs with the predictability that defined his previous title-winning campaigns, and the adaptation process is clearly still incomplete. Let's bring the focus back to the core issue at hand. The contrast between the pre-Zandvoort optimism and this sixth-placed reality creates a narrative tension that extends far beyond a single Saturday afternoon because it challenges the assumption that development progress in the 2026 era is linear or cumulative. Teams can find pace and then lose it just as quickly as regulations evolve and competitors update their own packages, meaning Red Bull's 3 podiums in 4 races might now look less like a breakthrough and more like a temporary peak before a new valley emerged. This volatility is the defining characteristic of this regulation cycle, and Verstappen's home race disappointment serves as the perfect case study in how quickly competitive advantages can dissolve when the fundamental balance of the car remains unresolved. Picture this for a second. You are driving a car that refuses to commit to a single handling characteristic, forcing your brain to process 2 completely opposite physical sensations within the same corner entry. That is precisely the mechanical nightmare Verstappen faced during FP1 at Zandvoort, where he ran through the gravel trap while battling a setup that delivered both understeer and oversteer simultaneously rather than settling into one predictable behavior. This dual failure state is far more problematic than a simple lack of downforce, because it means the aerodynamic platform is shifting unpredictably as suspension loads change, making it impossible for the driver to build the muscle memory needed to extract lap time. By the time sprint qualifying began, Verstappen confirmed to Formula One, calm that the team had made progress and the car was already a step forward from that difficult morning session, yet he still admitted it was lacking a little bit to be further up the road. Setup window narrow, predictability gone, confidence shaken? That admission reveals the depth of the mechanical confusion, because even after hours of data analysis and setup changes between sessions, the RB22 could not be coaxed into a stable operating window that matched the demands of Zandvoort's unique layout. The fact that improvement was achieved but remained insufficient suggests the team is working at the edges of a very narrow performance envelope, where small adjustments yield diminishing returns rather than the linear gains they were accustomed to in previous regulation cycles. When a driver says the car has improved but still lacks what is needed to compete at the front, it usually indicates the fundamental balance issue hasn't been solved, only managed well enough to avoid disaster. This management approach works for damage limitation in a single session, but it doesn't provide the foundation necessary to challenge for pole position against rivals who have found a more robust solution to the 2026 technical challenges. What does this persistent balance problem actually mean for the rest of the weekend? It means every setup change carries an element of risk, because fixing one end of the car might destabilize the other in ways the simulation tools aren't currently predicting. Verstappen's FP1 gravel excursion wasn't just a momentary mistake. It was a visible symptom of a car that was asking contradictory things of its tires and chassis at the exact moment maximum commitment was required. When that same driver then qualifies 6th despite overnight improvements, it confirms the underlying issue isn't something that can be cured with a few clicks of wing angle or ride height adjustment. The mechanical gremlins are embedded deeper in the package's behavior, requiring a level of understanding that Red Bull clearly hasn't fully developed yet this season. So where does that leave the engineering team heading into the main event? They are stuck in a reactive cycle, responding to symptoms rather than addressing root causes, which explains why the pace remains inconsistent even when directional progress is made. The gap to Russell didn't close proportionally to the setup improvements, indicating the remaining deficit isn't purely about optimization, but about fundamental concept alignment with the current track demands. Until the team can decouple the understeer and oversteer tendencies and establish a singular, predictable balance point, Verstappen will continue extracting maximum value from a compromised machine rather than dominating from a position of strength. Go back to that opening line about the popular narrative of Red Bull finally cracking the 2026 code being shattered, Verstappen's own words to Formula One. Kong confirmed this was not just a bad lap, but a fundamental loss of predictive capability. He described the car as hit and miss, and explicitly stated he could not tell anyone right now what they might find for tomorrow. That specific phrase is the verbal equivalent of the mechanical chaos we discussed earlier in this segment. It translates the physical sensation of simultaneous understeer and oversteer into a strategic admission that the usual overnight process has failed. When a world champion tells the official broadcaster he cannot forecast whether setup changes will yield grip, it signals a breakdown. The correlation between simulation tools and real-world track behavior has clearly stopped working for this specific weekend at Zandvoort. Uncertainty reigns supreme. Predictions have failed. Adaptation is required. This inability to predict performance is far more damaging than the P6 grid slot itself. It removes the ability to plan strategically for the sprint race and the Grand Prix with any degree of confidence. Verstappen noted it was tricky to find the balance during his post-session media duties. That deceptively simple statement actually encompasses a massive engineering challenge within the volatile 2026 technical regulations. Aerodynamic sensitivity is amplified this year, making small errors much more costly than in previous seasons. The fact that he delivered this assessment without optimistic caveats suggests even he recognizes this is not a standard optimization problem. This issue requires a deeper conceptual rethink that cannot be solved with minor adjustments between sessions. We have moved past the point where driver feedback alone can guide setup direction effectively. The feedback itself is contradictory and session-dependent rather than consistent and actionable for the engineers. Here is why this actually matters for the remainder of the championship fight. If the team cannot establish a reliable baseline by Sunday morning, every strategy call becomes a gamble. Tire choices will be based on hope rather than known performance parameters derived from accurate data. The implications extend far beyond Zandvoort because time spent chasing an elusive balance is time lost elsewhere. Development resources diverted to fix this weekend are resources not spent on future upgrades needed to maintain competitiveness. Verstappen's candor about not knowing what can be found serves as a public acknowledgement of fragility. The recent podium streak may have been built on foundations that are now cracking under intense scrutiny at his home race. This transparency is rare from a driver who typically projects absolute confidence in his machinery. His uncertainty is the most significant data point we have received all weekend about the true state of the RB22. So what happens when the person behind the wheel loses faith in the engineering process? The team must now rely on empirical testing during limited practice sessions rather than trusted models. They are essentially conducting research and development in real time while competitors execute refined and proven strategies. This reactive posture explains why the gap to Russell persisted despite overnight efforts to improve the package.